Good morning. This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope your week is off to a great start. We're going to go ahead and kick off our housing call today. We have another special guest. Today we'll be having Hudson Vaughn here to talk about property tax evaluations, what that means for homeowners and communities, as well as some of the options for appeals and the importance of that. So I just want to introduce Hudson really quick before inviting him to come onto the call off mute. So Hudson joined the North Carolina Housing Coalition this January, and he's here with us developing the Pilot Community Justice Collaborative. Many of you already know Hudson. He co-founded and served for a dozen years as the director of the Marion Chief Jackson Center, a community development nonprofit in the historically Black neighborhoods of Chapel Hill. In his time at the Jackson Center, he helped mobilize a community-run $3 million land bank and set of housing justice strategies that have led to the creation of over 50 diverse affordable housing units that have helped retain hundreds of long-term Black neighbors and led to the first rise in the Black population in the neighborhood in over 40 years. He recently graduated with his Master's in Divinity from Duke and published research from a year-long study with the UNC School of Government that focused on property tax inequities in North Carolina. For the last several years, Hudson has served as a consultant for housing justice and community engagement efforts across North Carolina, with a particular interest in mobilizing tools and strategies to prevent displacement in historically Black neighborhoods and support community self-determination and racial equity. So welcome, Hudson Vaughn. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Hudson, I want to go ahead and jump right in. Last week, Wake County announced their 2024 property revaluations, and I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about, what a revaluation is, why does it matter, and what does it mean for homeowners?
Yeah, so by state law, all properties are supposed to be valued at their market rate and taxed accordingly, but the state law only requires counties to do revaluations every 8 years, and it allows counties to do it as frequently as every 4 years, but that's actually much less frequently than most states. So all North Carolina counties conduct their revaluations then every 4 to 8 years, meaning that the county's tax office will use recent sales data and property information about the county's real estate to adjust the property values as close to market rate as they can estimate effective January 1st in a revaluation year, with the purpose ultimately of having values be more fair and equitable, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges around that. But this year, in addition to Wake County, 23 other counties across North Carolina will release or have released their revaluations effective for 2024. So as you know, property values change pretty drastically across time. So actually the long periods between valuations are actually part of the challenge, as they end up kind of tending to benefit properties that have quickly rising values. But because of how spread out the revaluations are, we end up seeing pretty massive shifts in property values that kind of seem all at once. So Wake County's that was just released is a great example. Average values for residential properties rose 53%, which is a huge amount. That means the $200,000 a home that was previously assessed at $200,000 would be now assessed at $306,000 if it had that average rise. But the challenge is not actually with the rise in overall values. It'll be with the shift in the relationship between properties that can change dramatically at those periods, and that's actually what will impact ultimately the property taxes. So the last thing I'll say about that before your next question, Stephanie, is just that revaluations are important because they distribute the property tax burden in a county. So in other words, you won't be able to tell what your property taxes will be, but when you are able to look at the relationship between your increase in value as a homeowner and other county values, that'll be a good indicator of what will happen to your taxes. So in Wake County, given that kind of huge rise in general. If one homeowner's property value went up 75%, then they're almost certainly going to see a property tax increase. But if your value only went up 10% in Wake County, you're actually probably going to see a decrease in property taxes ultimately. But because all these different counties across the state have revaluations effective this year, it's really important to pay attention and make sure that your values are equitable and seem fair with other sales around you.
Wonderful, thank you. And you started to talk about this a little bit, some issues with the revaluation process, but can you dig in a little more and tell us some other examples of issues with the revaluation process, or maybe some negative consequences that this process might have on communities, and any disparities that you've been able to find in your research and your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the analysis that I did with the School of Government, it turns out that in more than four, actually, of 5 counties statewide, so about 81% of our counties in the state, and this doesn't actually include Wake County, but higher value properties are underassessed systematically, while lower value properties are overassessed and overtaxed. And what this functionally means is that there's a higher property tax burden in our state for low-income homeowners and communities of color throughout the state. Our state's lowest income homeowners in dozens of counties actually, it looks like they pay as much as twice as much property taxes per year for their market value as their wealthiest neighbors year after year. And that's in a huge part of this challenge is that actually a lot of recent analysis has also showed that homeowners with higher value homes are actually many, many more times likely to appeal their values. So one of the reasons that we're going to talk about appeals is that for low-income communities and communities of color are actually much less likely to appeal their values, even though they're much more likely to have overassessed values and to actually pay a higher property tax burden. Part of this challenge is it's really hard to do mass assessments. Counties use what data they have, and they don't have a right to enter properties, and often don't, especially in rural counties, they often don't have the capacity to be on the ground and to see all of the properties. So even, Wake County has much more capacity than others to do their property tax valuations, and yet because they're assessing, hundreds of thousands of properties at once, there's still going to be certain neighborhoods and lots of individual houses that are assessed incorrectly or inequitably, which is part of the reason that this period of time where appeals are allowed for is so critical.
Wow. And you mentioned this, right? So you mentioned 2 disparities. One, that the properties that are typically higher value are underassessed and lower value properties are overassessed. So that larger tax burden being on low-income homeowners, but ironically enough, they're less likely to appeal. Could you talk to us a bit about the appeal process and why that matters and what options that homeowners have?
Yes. So everybody has a right to appeal actually any property in the county that they live in, so including your own, any property where you own, any county where you own property. And so that appeals process is actually, there's 2 parts of that. There's an informal appeals process, which is often in the couple of months following the release of the revaluation. In Wake County, the informal appeals go until March 1st. In other counties, it often extends a little bit later into the spring, so it will depend on what county folks live in, and they should have that on their notices. The informal appeals process is basically the ability to appeal directly to the tax office to look kind of more informally at the property to provide them additional information. But actually, there was an example that a professor shared with me that somebody appealed on a napkin and it held up in state court. So those appeals you don't have to hire an attorney, you don't have to have real estate expertise to be able to appeal. You can simply say that you believe that your property is overvalued and that you're appealing it. Although if you do establish additional things in Wake County, they'll send you a form that'll give you the opportunity to share more information about your property and whether there's information that's wrong, or to share about other properties around you that are similar that maybe show that your value is overassessed. So you'll have the opportunity to make that argument as well, but you're not required to in order to appeal. And then there's a second round that happens after that point. and which is that you can do a formal appeal, which is a similar process of submitting the appeal, but it goes a little bit later. In Wake County, I think it's until May 15th. And during that period, if you appeal, then you'll go in front of the Board of Equalization and Review in your county, which will be basically you'll present your evidence and the county will present theirs, and a volunteer board will actually make the decision about whether to grant your appeal or not. Does that answer your question, Stephanie?
Okay.
Is that clear?
Yeah, no, it does. And I don't mean to pull out another question. I guess what would be some of your best tips or pieces of advice for people maybe embarking on this for the first time or who want to appeal this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that's a great question, and I think that it's really important to look at to try to figure out, in Wake County, on their revaluation site, they actually make it relatively easy for folks to see. You can look at your own property, and then you can look up what its relationship is to the rest of property. So they have what's called a revenue neutral calculator, which will allow you to see, if the county lowers its tax rate to that kind of average, whether you would see a property tax increase or decrease. So it's really helpful for folks to try to figure out where they are in relationship to other properties. And then also, if you know homes around you better, you'll likely know what's in your home and what's homes sold around your house more than actually the county's tax office might. You might have seen the inside, you might know your neighbors, and being able to know details of differences between homes is actually one of the best ways to combat an assessment, because you can say, next door to me, there's a house that looks exactly like mine, but it just had $200,000 of renovations done to the inside. Now, the county tax office may not know all of that, and so they may assess our properties very similarly. So for me, it would be very helpful that I can say, actually, my inside has not been renovated for X, Y, and Z number of years, and meanwhile, this house that you've valued similarly has. And so kind of knowing your neighborhood or knowing a few houses, or at least sharing information about your house that they may not know can be really helpful. And I also just think it's really important for folks to know that, getting your assessed value lowered does not hurt your market value. So if you challenge your assessed value, it will not mean that you will end up being able to sell your house for less if you decide to sell in the future. And that's one thing that we really try to kind of break apart. Otherwise, high-income homeowners would not be challenging their tax values at such a higher rate.
Awesome. There's so much more that we could talk about today. I know that we'll be releasing a piece from you, Hudson, later on this month about property taxes and different, some of the same information that you provided today. But thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate this important information.
Thank you for having me.
All right, y'all, so we're going to dive in. We're going to have another sort of abbreviated call, but as always, don't forget to check out the call notes, because all the notes are there, all the links are there, and we won't be able to run through everything, but there's a lot of good information. The first thing I want to lift up from the Housing Coalition is if you would save the date. There's 2 dates we want you to save. The first is February 16th, 2024. We're having our session 3 of our Learning Collaborative. If you have been paying attention or have already been a part of it, we've been working through a 2-year grant with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as the North Carolina Division of Public Health, and engaging stakeholders across the state around housing needs for people impacted by the justice system and those who are at risk of overdose from opioids. So our 3rd session, we're having a set of learning collaboratives, a total of 6, where we'll be convening practitioners, advocates, and community members to provide education, build cross-sector relationships, and do some coalescing around shared policy goals. The registration link is in the call notes, and then we also have the recordings from the 1st and 2nd sessions available if you would like those as well. The second date we would love for you to save on your calendars is June 4th through the 5th, our Bringing It Home conference, Ending Homelessness in North Carolina. June 4th through the 5th at the McKimmon Center in Raleigh. And for the first time in 2019, we'll be back in person to learn, network, and collaborate with industry experts from across North Carolina and beyond. This is the conference that we co-host with the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness and the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services ESG office. Registration will open in March, but you can check out updates on our Bringing It Home 2024 conference page or email our awesome Director of Communications, Haley Solomon, if you have any questions. Moving on to federal updates, please continue to reach out to your representatives in Congress. It seems like they have approached a deal on 302B funding, which includes the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill that funds HUD's vital affordable housing and homelessness programs. We're still waiting on the details of that agreement, so we've included a link on the latest information that we have. But please keep applying pressure and reminding them of the impact of not providing additional funding for HUD in this particular market. Any sort of flat funding or not insufficient addition of funds will result in a lot of people losing access to their assistance, to their programs, and even possibly their homes. Last week, many of you spoke with us, or you even participated in the hearing and in the public comment session that was held on the homeowners associations. On the property insurance rate hike. So we heard a lot of stories. If you are comfortable sharing stories about how this would impact you, your community, or your business, we would really love for you to fill out a brief survey that we have. It's anonymous if you would like it to be. AARP has also launched different advocacy efforts against this, and we will continue to monitor it and include all the information that we find, including a detailed list of cities and counties with the requested increases. Public comments on this proposed insurance hike are still being accepted through this Friday, February 2nd. So even if you participated in the virtual session, email your comments, send letters, deliver your comments to the North Carolina Department of Insurance. Your voice really, really matters, and this is something that impacts everyone across the state. Moving on to some local news. We already mentioned this. This is the first part of our call, but Wake County tax evaluations have soared in value. So they recently released their property reappraisal values, and a lot of residents are shocked, right? And as housing prices continue to rise, we're seeing that families are moving further out for more affordable homes. So we have a link to some details about that evaluations, and we want you to keep a lookout for Hudson's piece about what next steps are and what some of the best practices are in addressing that. And reports and resources, America's Rental Housing 2024 national report was released last week by the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University. The report found that housing is unaffordable for half of U.S. renters, that rent growth has cooled down, but rents are still much higher than pre-pandemic prices, and incomes have not kept pace with rent increases over the past 2 decades. Homelessness is also at an all-time high. The rental stock is aging, and the average unit is actually 44 years old, and the need for rental assistance is greater than ever. This report goes really deep, has a lot of great data, so I definitely highly recommend you all checking it out. There's also a recording of the release itself, and one of the quotes that I took away from that streaming, and it's something that we say all the time, is, you know, we really need resources that can actually meet the scale of the need, and we currently do not have that. Another piece from the Joint Center for Housing Studies that I want to lift up, and this is just something that caught my nerdy eye, is a piece about estimating the national housing shortfall and really how many methodologies exist out there, how many formulas or approaches exist about measuring this sort of gap that we have in that is what we use to quantify our need for affordable housing. But what I really appreciate about it is it highlights all the different ways that you could approach that, as well as the fact that if you look at it from the perspective of how many homes are needed for those making the lowest incomes, then the gap is even larger, showing that this crisis really is disproportionately, being a burden for those making on the lower end of the income spectrum. Moving on to events, today at 2 p.m., the National Low Income Housing Coalition will be having a webinar about FEMA's recent disaster recovery reform. And then on February 5th, there will be a Urban Institute webinar on zoning reforms that improve access to housing for all, talking through evidence and lessons for advocates. There are several pieces in the news related to the insurance hike. There's a piece from North Carolina Newsline that highlights that the proposed insurance hike could send a 75-year-old man in Swansboro back to work. This is just one example of some of the stories that we're hearing and that we're seeing. Another piece I want to list up is from CNBC that talks about how housing affordability is actually reshaping migration trends and impacting where people are moving. Like I mentioned, we have a lot of other things in our call notes today, so make sure you take a moment and review them once we release the recording. I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Don't forget to reach out to your representatives about fiscal year 24 federal funding for HUD and for community development and homelessness. But also do not forget that this Friday is the last day to kind of submit public comments around the proposed insurance hike. Please let us know if you need anything. Reach out if you want us to cover anything in particular. And I hope you have a great rest of your week.